Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Are you ready for an I-9 audit? Before we begin, I'd like to remind you that we are not attorneys. This session is intended for educational and informational purposes only. We do hope that you find these presentations helpful and informative, but the information presented today should not in any way be construed as legal advice. As always, if you have questions about how this information may affect your business specifically, we recommend that you consult with your business advisor. AHOLA is a family-owned payroll and HR services provider headquartered in Brecksville, Ohio, with over 50 years of payroll, tax, and HR experience, having served over 10,000 small businesses nationwide, offering a full range of payroll and HR services and software. Please allow me to introduce you to today's speaker, Corinne Saliba. Corinne is a part of AHOLA's proactive HR consulting division and will be delivering today's content regarding preparing for an I-9 audit. Corinne has been with AHOLA for over 2 years and enjoys working with small business clients in several diverse industries, including light manufacturing and business services. Prior to AHOLA, Corinne earned her Master's of Business Administration and Bachelor's degree with an HR concentration from Baldwin Wallace University in Berea, Ohio. Corinne maintains her Senior Professional of Human Resources certification, accredited by HRCI, and is especially passionate about bringing HR consulting clients up to date with compliance topics that mitigate the risk for legal issues and decrease turnover. Corinne is a strong advocate for the creation of job descriptions and hopes that you find this presentation insightful when maintaining yours. Corinne, over to you.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for the introduction, Amy. As Amy mentioned, we have a lot of content to cover today, so we may not have enough time for Q&A at the end of this session. Don't worry, though, we will provide contact information at the end, so be sure to stay tuned for that. Today on the agenda, we will cover the following topics as related to I-9 foreign compliance. First, we'll begin by reviewing general best practices, and then following general best practices, we will review temporary policies as related to COVID-19. Then I will provide some ways for employers to avoid common mistakes, discrimination issues, and human error. And then finally, we'll wrap up with potential penalties that employers face if they are audited and out of compliance. Let's get started. What is the purpose of a government Form I-9? Form I-9 requirements were established in November 1986 when Congress passed the Immigration Reform and Control Act, also known as IRCA. IRCA prohibits employers from hiring people, including U.S. citizens, for employment in the United States without verifying their identity and employment authorization via this form first. The IRCA requires all U.S. employers to complete a Form I-9 verifying employee eligibility to work in the U.S. for every employee hired after that November 6th date. We will touch on the areas shown in this graphic throughout this presentation. Regardless of your business's size, all U.S. employers must comply with the Form I-9 requirements. The mandatory document is used to verify your employee's identity and verifies their eligibility. The form, otherwise known as the Employment Eligibility Verification, is a document established by the United States Citizenship and Immigration Services, also called USCIS. There are 3 sections of this form that are conjointly completed by the hired employee and the authorized representative of your organization. Again, all employees must have a completed I-9 file per designated retention guidelines. As a rule of thumb, anyone who receives a W-2 in January must complete an I-9 form. Owners or entities of the company who do not receive a W-2 or are 1099 individuals do not complete this form. The government agencies who enforce the I-9 form administration are as follows: the Department of Homeland Security and the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency. As we navigate the presentation, we will continue to discuss what penalties are associated by improper administration, as well as what these agencies are looking for in the event your business is randomly audited by ICE. If your business isn't familiar with the I-9, or if you're here today to improve your I-9 form procedures, here are some basic requirements and best practices to be aware of. First, always use the latest version of the form. AHOLA will link the latest version of the form to our blog for you to download. You can also access the latest version of the form by visiting www.uscis.gov. Second, as your employee and your company's authorized representative complete the form, make sure that the information is legible. Tip number 3, verify that the date entered in section 2 of the form matches the employee's payroll record for date of hire. Tip 4, be mindful of your requirement to examine the employee's portion of the I-9 completion to ensure that it is completed accurately. For example, make sure that the employee uses their legal name when completing their section and that their name matches the documents that they provide you with. Tip 5, understand your requirement as the employer to properly maintain all forms for active and terminated employees. Tip number 6, be prepared to be audited at any time. Tip number 7, if you are an entity that must electronically file with E-Verify, be familiar with what is required by your company by the E-Verify program. And finally, the last tip, going along with being prepared, prevent the preventable by learning about the form and any updated requirements. We'll touch on additional best practices for sections 1 through 3 in the slides to come. The USCIS and ICE established temporary policies regarding employers' responsibilities for I-9 document inspection once COVID-19 began. Because so many companies conducted business remotely or were limiting in-person interaction, COVID made it challenging for employers to review documents timely or in person at the peak of the pandemic. The temporary policies have been extended over the past 2 years, but I should say, expire at the end of April. The temporary policies are related to the employer's inspection of the documents, not necessarily when the form should be completed. So employers will eventually need to see those documents in person if they didn't already, as employees return to the office. Employers should prepare a strategy for verifying these documents and updating I-9 forms with the expectation of a looming deadline. Here's a screenshot of the first page in section 1 of the I-9. Regardless of the version, the form doesn't tend to change very much with its general look and layout. Employees must complete section 1 of the Form I-9 on the first day of the employee's employment. If the employee is in need of someone else to prepare or translate the document, that person would also complete section 1. Employees must be prepared to present acceptable documents providing their identity and work authorization to the employer within 3 days of their first day of employment, which we'll discuss for section 2. As for common mistakes most often seen in section 1, the employee does not always properly include their legal name, or other names such as other last name used, such as maiden names, are often prevalent. Another mistake is that the employee does not complete the document within the required time frame, which again is their first day of hire. The employee can also forget to check their citizenship status on that first page, or sometimes there is missing, incomplete, or correct information in the preparer/translator portion of section 1. Now we'll move on to discuss section 2. Included on this slide is a screen grab of what section 2 looks like. This section is completed by the employer. Employers or their authorized representative must physically examine the documents and complete section 2 of the Form I-9 within 3 days of the employee's first day of employment. An employee must show his or her documents from List A, which shows both identity and employment authorization, or one document from List B and List C. List B documents show identity and List C documents show employment authorization. It is imperative that employees do not dictate what documents the employee brings in for verification. Instead, the employer can print a list of acceptable List A, B, and C items and explain the employee can choose from those acceptable examples. The most common mistakes that employers make when filling out section 2 are some of the following. 1, the employer does not enter the employee's last name, first name, middle initial, and most commonly their citizen immigration status in the employee info in section 1. That's the area on the very top of section 2. Also, the employer doesn't always enter the acceptable List A document or acceptable List B and C documents on the form. Also common, the employer may not enter the document title, the issuing authority, any numbers or expiration dates associated with the documentation presented. Note that not every document will actually have all of these things, such as a social security card will not always have or shouldn't have an expiration date. Sometimes the employer does not enter its business title, the name, or the appropriate address that is legally tied to the entity. Also, the employer doesn't always enter the date that the employment began. Again, this is the date of hire that should match the payroll records. Sometimes the employer or the authorized representative forgets to sign, date, or enter their title, and most often it's right in the name of the certification. Most commonly, and probably the most punitive, the employer does not always complete Section 2 by that third business day or the third day after the employee began employment. Here's an example of what Section 3 looks like. Section 3 of the Form I-9 is only used if you're rehiring employees, if there are name changes, or if there's any work expiration. We will discuss common mistakes to avoid regarding Section 3 next. Section 3 is completed by the employer, again, if applicable. Oftentimes, the mistakes are as follows. The employer does not enter the employee's last name, first name, and middle initial in the employee name from Section 1 area. The employer sometimes forgets to enter the document title, the number of expiration date, the number or expiration date of the acceptable documentation that's presented to them. The employer does not enter the date of rehire if applicable. Sometimes the employer forgets to enter the employee's new name. Sometimes the employer does not sign, date, or enter his or her name in the certification. And then finally, sometimes the employer forgets to complete Section 3 again after that employee's work authorization has expired. To prevent issues related to discrimination or issues surrounding the E-Verify process, employers should note the following. Employers cannot, based on an individual's citizen, immigration status, or national origin, ask to see the employment authorization documents before an individual accepts a job offer. They cannot refuse to accept a document or refuse to hire an individual based off the document if it will expire in the future. They can't refuse an acceptable receipt. They can't request a specific document for the Form I-9 or assume that they have a specific document such as a driver's license. They also cannot request specific documents to create an E-Verify case or based on an E-Verify tentative non-confirmation. Now we'll talk about the Form I-9 audit process. The Immigration Reform and Control Act, enacted on November 6, 1986, requires employers to verify the identity and employment eligibility of their employees and sets forth criminal and civil sanctions for employment-related violations. The administration and inspection process is initiated with the service of Notice of Inspection, also known as NOI, upon an employer. Employers receive at least 3 business days to produce the Form I-9s requested in the NOI. In addition, ICE generally requests that the employer provide supporting documentation, which may include, but is not limited to, a copy of the employer's payroll, a list of active and terminated employees, articles of incorporation, and business licenses. When an employer responds to an NOI by producing Forms I-9, ICE agents and/or auditors conduct an inspection of the forms for compliance. When ICE finds technical or procedural violations, the employer receives at least 10 business days to make any corrections. An employer may receive a monetary fine for all substantive and uncorrected technical violations to make corrections. Employers who are found to have knowingly hired or continue to employ unauthorized workers will be required to cease the unlawful activity and may be civilly fined or criminally prosecuted. Additionally, an employer who is found to have knowingly hired or continue to employ unauthorized workers may be subject to debarment by ICE. Upon completing its inspection of an employer's Form I-9 process and any related supporting documentation, ICE will notify the employer of its findings in writing by issuing one of the following notices: a notice of inspection results, a notice of suspect documents, a notice of discrepancies, notice of technical or procedural failures, a warning notice, or finally, a notice of intent to fine. Here are the penalties associated with the audits conducted by ICE. The base fine is established by the number of infractions divided by the number of Form I-9s that should have been presented for inspection. Total penalties are determined by base amount, size of business, good faith of the employer, seriousness of violations, involvement of unauthorized workers, and history of previous violations. There are civil penalties for paperwork violation and for knowingly hiring, recruiting, referral, or retention of unauthorized aliens. Civil penalties for I-9 paperwork violations include the minimum penalty, which has increased from $237 last year to $252 per paperwork violation. And then the maximum penalty has increased from $2,360 from last year, 2021, to $2,507 per every single paperwork violation. Civil penalties for knowingly hiring, recruiting, referrals, or retention of unauthorized aliens include the penalty for the first offense, which has increased from $590 to $4,722, up to $627 to $5,016. The penalty for the second offense, which has increased from $4,722 all the way to $11,803, to the 2022 version, which is now $5,016 to $12,537. And then the penalty for the third or subsequent offenses has increased from $7,000 to $23,000, all the way up from $7,500 to $25,067. To conclude our conversation, I want to provide you with a checklist to survive an ICE audit. Should you be audited, you should start by being up to date before that even happens. So start by conducting an internal audit by the following methods. Make a list of all of your current employees that you employ, and then a list of employees who have terminated in the last 3 years. Have copies of all I-9 forms, electronic or physical for current employees. I would suggest that you choose one method and stick to it. So if you're currently collecting I-9s electronically or currently collecting them physically, try to do one or the other, and then collate your I-9s to either that method that you choose to do going forward. Make sure that you note the version of the I-9 that you're using. Use the most current version going forward. The version will be listed on the top right-hand corner. Note that there should be one coming out later in 2023. And then finally, collect any other missing forms. All employees hired after or on and after November 6, 1986 should have an I-9 on file. If they don't, they need to be contacted and instructed to provide the proper documentation. As an employer addressing those employees, you should apologize if the form was not collected at the beginning of their employment. However, you need to explain that the form must be completed under federal law, and that failure to provide the necessary documentation may lead to termination. Also, side note, if for some reason an employee does not provide their I-9 documentation to verify by the first 3 days of hire, it is okay to terminate them and then eventually bring them back once they're able to do so. Communicate with each employee individually, verbal or written, to make sure that they keep a copy of all communication on the Form I-9 in an audit file. You should establish a date when the employees need to provide the required documents. Generally, they should provide them the next day of work. The documents should be originals, and when the necessary documents are available, the Form I-9 should be completed immediately. Use the current dates for the form, even if the date of hire was years ago. Attach a note to the corrected form explaining that the I-9 was completed during the audit. This is crucial as it shows that you made that correction and also made an effort to be in compliance while not willfully breaking the law. Audit current employees. Employers can only correct technical errors in section 2 and 3 because those are the sections that they complete as the employer. So errors in section 1 must be completed or fixed, I should say, by the employee. Separate your forms into 2 files. Have one file of I-9s that were completed properly, and then a second for those who contain errors. Any changes should be clearly shown as a correction. Use different colored ink, draw a line through incorrect information and initial, and then date any changes you make to make sure it's obvious that it was corrected. Any major errors, such as entire sections left blank or based on unacceptable documents, may require a whole new form to be completed. Also, you will want to go ahead and review any errors. So make a list of I-9s that have errors and then create an audit log that will be included in the same file as all of your I-9s. It should include the employees' names, any errors that you find, and the actions that were taken to correct those errors. Organize and correct terminated employee I-9s. Determine the Form I-9 retention period. Once an employee is terminated, then correct any errors for terminated employees using the same process as you would for current employees. If you are unable to correct an error, such as a missing employee signature in Section 1, make a note in the audit log and on a note on the appropriate Form I-9. In this section, we reviewed the Form I-9's importance and common mistakes related to the administration and retention of the form. We've covered compliance, completion, E-Verify, as well as employee and employer requirements and the documents required. Thank you for allowing me to discuss this topic with you today, and I wish you success with your I-9 organization.
Thank you for presenting today, Corinne, and thank you everyone for taking the time to join us today. We invite you to stay informed by visiting our blog at ahola.com/blog and subscribing to Proactive HR Inspire, a free biweekly email update where we share trending HR topics, tips, and best practices for small businesses. Please email proactivehr@ahola.com to be added to the email list, or if you have any questions about today's webinar. Thanks again and have a great afternoon.